Welcome to Writer's Digest Presents. Hosted by the editors of Writer's Digest, this monthly podcast features conversations with writing and publishing experts whose insights will help ignite your creative vision, hone your skills, build your platform, and get your work out into the world.
Hello everyone, I'm content editor Michael Woodson, and welcome to Writer's Digest Presents. I'm so excited for today's episode. I'm chatting with journalist and author Robert Fieseler about his new book, American Scare: Florida's Hidden Cold War on Black and Queer Lives, which is available for purchase today. Robert is a journalist investigating marginalized groups and a scholar excavating forgotten histories. A National Lesbian and Gay Journalists Association Journalist of the Year and recipient of the Pulitzer Traveling Fellowship, his debut book, Tinderbox, won 7 awards, including the Edgar Award. Robert and I talked all about the research that goes into writing historical nonfiction, the walls you hit when institutions don't want certain things remembered, and the fiction craft that goes into writing narrative nonfiction. But before we begin, I just want to say that we will not be having a new episode after our July episode. We'll be taking 1 month off with no new episode in August, but we'll be back in September. This is to give us a little break in the midst of all of the fun chaos of the Writer's Digest annual conference next month. And if you're interested in attending, visit our conference website at writersdigestconference.com for more information. But now, without further ado, Writer's Digest presents Robert Fieseler. Okay, Robert, thank you so much for joining me today. Thank you for joining Writer's Digest. I'm so excited to talk to you about American Scare, but first, I wanted to bring people in on a little background. You and I know each other, sort of. We've been in each other's ears for years because we share a mutual love of my sister-in-law, Jess. If you wouldn't mind giving our listeners a little background.
Jess is one of my favorite people in the world. Yeah. She was the last woman that my husband, Ryan, ever dated. And she, in the midst of dating him, recognized, oh my God, we got a sparkly one here. And so she assisted him and did a great service to humanity and to me by helping him come out. And then they were best of friends. And this was when they were, the transition come out was when they were both living in Cincinnati, about to move to Chicago. And then when my future husband, Ryan, moved to Chicago, we all were part of each other's Chicago chosen family. We were part of this roommates, friends situation. And that we had an era, honey. Yeah. And then we've all, obviously all apartment friendships like that, they end at some point, but we've kept really close and sort of I would say she's one of my closest friends and favorite people in the world.
Yeah. Yeah. And like I said, I just feel like I've known you forever because you are, every time it's what's Bobby up to? What's Bobby and Ryan up to? And they tell us, and it feels like I've known you, so this is very exciting to get to talk to you.
Yeah.
And for another reason than to talk to you.
I fangirl for you and your husband too. Are you kidding me?
Well, you know Josh.
And then I know all about Josh's journey through Jess. So I've been rooting for you guys from the background, just emotionally sending good energy forever.
Oh, and then feeling that.
Your wedding photos were so darn cute. Are you kidding me?
Thank you. Wow. I often think about who let us, we were child brides though, so young. Who let us do that? I'm so grateful, obviously. I met my soulmate, but.
Right. And I did that too, right? Well, Ryan was younger. Ryan was 19 when we got together. And then I was 23, about to be 24. We didn't marry. We didn't have the possibility of marrying until later on, and we only got married in 2018. But it's been almost, it's weird to think about it, but me and my husband have been together for almost 20 years.
Yeah.
But I believe in when you know,
yes.
You're in love.
Truly.
And whatever. So this is how some people's baseline is you just exist from a place of profound love and domestic wonderfulness.
Truly.
And it enables you to achieve all these other things that you're able to achieve.
I promise we'll get to the book, but Josh and I were just talking about this yesterday. I was we were coming home from book club and I was I love him so much. And I was I know it's a weird feeling to know that this is the happiest I could be. And I know it's anything can happen, but it is I do. That is my baseline of I feel very lucky. I met someone I like love to be around all of the time. But anyway, really loved
it's
it.
such a gift. It's like
Yeah.
you're in on a secret no one else knows.
Yeah.
So anyway, sorry that we're all this for other people that are, if you're on the single scene, you're looking for love, you're gonna get there. It's possible. Like, I don't want to be, but we're all just like bragging that we have this thing. But like, gay love is real.
It
Gay
is
love
so,
is real.
it's the best. Yeah.
Yeah.
But yeah, so as we are talking now, we're a few months away from publication, but as listeners are hearing this, American Scare is available to buy. And I just want to say congratulations on this book. I loved it. I had such a emotional reaction to it. And I have this thing with reading books that I love that I never want them to end. And I mapped out, which I never do this really, but I mapped out like how many pages a day I could read to make the reading experience last as long as possible. And I finished this yesterday morning, and I texted my husband, Josh, and I was like, I just finished Bobby's book. And he was like, I could tell you were loving that. And I was like, really? And he was like, yeah, every single time you talked to me about it, you were so emotional and so engaged with it. So I'm just like so excited for people to read this. And I'm so excited for our listeners to get a better idea of what it's like to write historical nonfiction. But before we get into it, would you mind telling our listeners a little bit about what American Scare is about?
Sure. First of all, thank you for that tremendous compliment. Like, it means so much to me that you were reading my baby son. This is just how I think of my new book, and savoring it and taking time with it, and even your description of your experience of reading the end of the book means a lot to me, because I spent forever 5-6 years on this, and I really thought about I really think about spiral staircase structuring, about like how does a book start, and then how does the ending resolve, and what do people walk away? And you would not believe, I thought it was going to take me forever to write the last line of the book, and it just I was so exhausted. I was like, I had a 2-week copy editing process, and the last line just actually popped out when I had nothing. And like, so it means a lot to me that you and I don't want to spoiler it, because it's probably one of the best things I've ever written. But like, thank you so much for sharing that. I'm sorry, I don't put that with me, because I put everything in this book. So American Scare is it's a nonfiction historical account of that excavates the origins of a largely forgotten anti-communist purge, which for 9 years, from 1956 to 1965, held residents of the state of Florida ransom through this extrajudicial committee with the power to investigate Black and queer subversives or anyone they didn't like and declare them enemies of the people. It was led by this charming segregationist Dixiecrat Southerner named Charlie Johns. And what he perpetrated through this committee became so notorious throughout the South and in Florida that they nicknamed it after his last name. They called it the Johns Committee. So it's this true story of this all-out domestic war, this protracted act of tyranny that rooted a certain kind of fear and a certain kind of white prejudice so deeply in Florida politics and in national politics that it continues to sadly affect us today.
Yeah, which I have like very specific questions about later on. Like the eeriness of reading it today was just another part that I couldn't get over in reading it. But before we get to that, I am very curious about like how you choose projects, and your author bio suggests you have an interest in marginalized groups and forgotten history, as you've said as well just now. But zooming in closer, like how do you know when something that you're researching or a piece of history that you've maybe even stumbled upon is about to be something that is the thing you want to uncover and become your next big project?
Yeah, it's a lot like falling in love. But like from a horrific standpoint, like because you're dealing with history. So it's typically something that engages me intellectually, but while simultaneously taking this side door into my heart, and in a way where I can't stop obsessing about it. And then I'll know, and that minute to minute obsession, I'll know can create the wellspring that's going to be able to give me the energy to sustain what is a very long project. Like literary history, literary journalism, nonfiction projects take a long time.
Yeah.
A lot happens in 5 years. I call it like tree time.
Right.
It's the amount of time it takes for a tree to sometimes bloom and grow. So this initially came to me. Typically, what happens is people come to you with stories and they'll be like, oh my God, you got to hear about whatever. Or sometimes people will be at a bar or at a party talking about something that happened around them, or can you believe this? And something will stick in my craw. And then I'll kind of circle back multiple times on it. So initially I didn't know about the Florida Johns Committee. My mentor from the Columbia J School, Sam Friedman, had gone to visit this exhibit in Miami called the Queer Miami exhibit in 2019, which was done by this really famous queer Florida and Latin America scholar named Julio Capó. So anyway, I was like, okay, he's like, you have to visit this, Bobby. You're going to be, your mind will be blown. I was like, okay, I'm going to figure it out. I was broke. I didn't know how to, I basically, our finances had crashed right after our first book, Tinderbox, had published and was successful, but it had gained like a cult following, and it was taking a while for any sort of honorarium money or anything to circle back. And so eventually it took me several months to scrape together basically $120 to figure out some morning where I could fly from New Orleans, where I live, to Miami, and then in first flight, and then fly back at night and see this exhibit. That was the purpose of it. And so I did. I figured out. I flew into Miami International Airport. I went over to the Queer Miami exhibit, and there was one corner of the exhibit that was devoted to videos and also historical artifacts of the Johns Committee. There was a video screen, and there was a scholar who is a very famous Johns Committee scholar named Stacy Brockman, who wrote this really important book called Communists and Perverts Under the Palms. And I hadn't yet met her, but as I walked in, she said something like, this is just the audio that was in the room. She said something like, I don't think many people know about the Florida Johns Committee anymore. And that was it. It's like she just teased me, hook, line, and sinker. I just couldn't. It's this scholar who devoted, herself to so much of this study of the subject. And she's admitting that there's still widespread ignorance. And I was like, done. And so I was like, I got to find out everything I can about this book, and I have to see is there more terrain that people can cover. And as I did my research, it turns out, sadly, there was this committee in the 50s and 60s in Florida had done so much damage to so many people. There sadly was much more terrain to plumb. And I discovered, and this humbled me in the course of writing my book, I realized there's probably 5 or 6 more books that can be written about all of the dastardly deeds of this committee. And so anyway, that's how the Johns Committee story crossed my path, and how I knew I felt called to write it. I felt within my purview of what I do in terms of narrative history, within what I do from an investigative journalism standpoint, and my insistence on naming names and also finding ways to name and honor and recognize and bear witness to the suffering of victims. I thought, I can do something here.
That's really, it's very an ambitious brain to hear someone say, not people don't know a lot about this, and for you to say this is what I want to do, because then in reading this gives nothing away, but Florida has done everything they can to make it as impossible as they can for people to know about this, even to the point where in the book you mentioned I don't know if I'm going to be able to do this. They aren't letting me have access to what I need in order to uncover this.
Yeah. So the majority of the Johns Committee records, when the Johns Committee folded in 1965, were sealed from public release. And then they entered this weird sort of hazy archival status. Even when the state had become liberalized, become more progressive in terms of its freedom of information and the availability of what's called sunshine laws, which the state of Florida is so proud of. It's like they're the sunshine state. This is the place where everything's supposed to be left in the open. No, not this. This was the thing they kept hidden. And then when they finally were forced by a constitutional amendment to release the Johns Committee papers in 1993, in the early 1990s, they redacted the names of all of the victims. Not the names of the perpetrator, but the names of the victims, and which hampered the ability for a certain kind of narrative scholarship to be done. You could still do really great ethnography, sociology work. You could still write a really great academic, argumentative piece. But something happens in our country when we allow a tragedy to become nameless. And what happens is it ceases to engage the brain as a story, and it becomes statistical, unfortunately. And so I thought, I'm going to be, this is so like Eric, I don't even know why I thought I could do this, but I was like, I'm going to be the guy to figure out how to undo the work they did when they redacted it.
Right.
And then I got to the state archives and I was like, oh shit. like oh my God, it's way worse than I ever thought. Like I've you know, as a journalist, I've FOIA requested the FBI. I'm used to seeing redacted papers, but this looked like China. Like it was crazy how thorough a job they had done. And then of course I have this problem that I've had since I was very little, where I want to know the story that others don't want me to know.
Sure, of course.
So I thought, that's the juicy stuff. I mean, like, that's just like the gay gossip
exactly,
as a grown-up. So I was like,
the
kiki. I don't know if I'll ever say that again, but like, I got to figure out the hidden parts. And so that began this whole other journey. But you're right, that there was a point in the midst of about a year and a half into research, especially when the state of Florida let all the kids go to school during COVID, but guess what? They closed the whole archive. They said that COVID was so dangerous, the archive couldn't be open,
of course.
But schools could be open. Okay. So this is a sign that obviously it's inconsistent application of sentiment involving. So they conveniently closed. And then when I got to the archive, I realized, and I almost had like this breakdown moment where I'm like, it would take me 20 years, just the way that they served out the Flick papers. And I'm not blaming the archivists for this. These are state employees, and they're following legislative statute, but they only let you have one page of one document. You don't even get to see oftentimes the full thing in one folder at one time, limited number of boxes. And they made me sit in one specific seat where they then watched me the whole time as I was going through this stuff. And I'm just like a gay guy in Tallahassee, Florida, burning through my book advance, right? Trying to figure out how am I going to break this case.
Yeah.
And it got desperate, where I was thinking, when do I email my publisher and tell them what the crazy things I promised them, the way I talked myself into a yes with them, I might not be able to achieve.
That's like the high stakes of writing history nonfiction, is like the what happens behind the scenes of like being able to even do that. And I want to go back to something you said about like sort of narrative nonfiction, because it is very narrative, and I think a lot of the quality for me and like the emotional part of it was that the tone that was set really instantly. And it begins, the book begins from your point of view as the author, sort of frantically trying to get these 20 plus boxes of historical documents out of Florida before the hurricane hits in 2021. And it reads very like, my editor and I were talking, and she was like, that the opening was so thrilling. Like it read like an espionage almost. And as the reader, like it really, I feel like it set the tone for like a lot of these feelings of like foreboding feelings I was going to feel, especially with all this time spent in the beginning, really getting to know Charlie Johns, like who he was, where he came from, why power was so important to him. And in reading all of that, it felt a little bit like dramatic irony, or like, I know what he will be capable of. And I had this anxiety of being like, oh my gosh, I can't believe this guy's about to do all of this stuff. And it felt like almost like a villain origin story. And in that sense, very literary to me. And this is a long-winded way of asking you, like, do you employ like fiction craft elements at all when you're piecing together the arc of a true story?
Yes. I only read fiction for joy and for pleasure. Nonfiction I read mostly for work and to learn things. A lot of it's very artlessly created, but it's designed to educate.
Yeah.
And I, growing up, like loved nonfiction books that that gave me that like Emily Dickinson
Totally.
top of the head taken off feeling, where it feels like you're tapping into the great vein of reality. And so I remember as a teenager reading John Berendt's Midnight in the Garden of Good and Evil, and him describing how he was driving into Savannah, Georgia, was like entering a sea of green or something. Like, he said something like that. And then I remember even more, I read H.G., or now he's called Buzz Bissinger, but H.G. Bissinger's Friday Night Lights, and the preface to it, where he's basically, you can just read the preface and understand the whole book.
Yeah.
But it's an immersion reporting book. But the last 3 works is he's talking about the spindly lights that of a Friday night light and light that light up these random Texas towns. And he used the words like to sow. He said that they ignite the darkness. And like, I could not. I want to write like, I aspire to write like that, where I love nonfiction that can employ literary and aesthetic sensibilities, where they have a respect for the line, for the musicality of language, where they have a respect for and an understanding of mood and atmosphere, which is very difficult to communicate to like an academic historian, but I think that matters. And I also look like plotting, setup and payoff, making sure if you introducing like Chekhov and playwrights, introducing threads and paying them off later in ways that you're just like, oh my God, that's why they included it earlier. And I like the way that literature allows for revelation, where there's just moments where you're like, you just like, you feel like your entire body's lit up. And
I had that several times in reading American Scare.
Oh my God.
There's one part I just can't talk about because it'll give away too much, but like there was a moment where I was like, yes, finally.
Okay, good. I'm glad that And also and like I was inspired when you brought up I was inspired by several real pretty serious literary sources when I thought about how I was going to structure and present Charlie Johns and his life. And my main source actually was Milton's Paradise Lost. Where I thought about Milton's sympathetic portrayal of, it's the ultimate anti-hero of Lucifer, which I don't consider Charlie Johns to be. Someone's going to listen to this and think I'm thinking Charlie Johns is the devil. No, I'm not saying this. What I'm saying is like the model that he created, where he sets up this person who you develop a lot of sympathies for, who then does a bunch of things that confuse you to the point that you eventually maybe you get really strained and you might change your mind about the person. And as the story goes, I thought that's probably the best example of a story that does that and does it really well. If you really have and Paradise Lost is not an easy book. It's not an easy epic poem. Like you got to, in order to read it well, you have to be in a part of a book club, or you have, or be lucky like me, like where I had a professor who loved Milton.
Yes, me too. I had a great professor when we read Paradise Lost.
Who animates this for you. It's sort of like that's the best way to experience great works like the Odyssey or something like that too, which is like, that's like when you go, once you go to Homer, that's like the baseline for all this stuff. But anyway, so like I think that sort of cultural literacy and that sort of fiction prose literacy is really important for for nonfiction writers to pick up some of those skills and to then apply them to work about the confounding, infinite, frustrating, impossible to understand phenomenon of reality, which
Mm-hmm.
is really the altar that nonfiction writers also bow to. So
Sure.
we're trying to see, and in which tremendously dramatic moments do occur.
Yeah.
But it's how do you create it in a way that's accountable to fact check and to
Mm-hmm.
citation. And I love that extra challenge. I think
Yeah.
so. I think it's possible to write it in a way that's gorgeous,
Mm-hmm.
and in a way where it becomes what the French just consider it all prose, where
Mm-hmm.
you would understand why a great nonfiction narrative piece could exist side by side, like a great work of autobiographical fiction or memoir, or even fiction.
Yeah.
They're at some level they are all trying to do similar things to a reader, which is to be a teleportation device and to
Yeah.
transport you in your mind somewhere.
Mm-hmm.
One's based on imagination, right? And one's based on collage and curation and research, but both are possible. Both are capable of getting you there, I think.
I totally agree. And this sort of draws me to my next question about like what your process is like, because I'm just curious what the drafting stage looks like for you. How do you organize your research and interviews and cross references
Yeah.
as you start to form the book?
Oh God. Well, okay. It's like not as pretty as
Yeah,
so like
it shouldn't be.
some people are very well organized. I operate in piles, where a pile of things is, and my husband, God bless him, like goddess bless him, like through a lot of this process has like, I think credit to him, he didn't murder me, because I took over an entire room of our apartment. As you said, like I have more than 20 bankers boxes worth of
Yeah.
original Johns Committee records that I got from the whistleblower Bonnie Stark when I initially just met her to try to compliment her about her MA thesis on the Johns Committee from the 1980s. Turns out she was the first Johns Committee scholar. Turns
Mm-hmm.
out she was instrumental in the document release. Turns out she'd gotten a secret second set of all the records from a
Yeah.
sympathetic member of the Florida Senate. So anyway, so I had all the stuff Bonnie Stark gave me here, and I had to at some point go through all of it. So, and I in order to figure, I've never dealt with this much paper in my life. It was
Yeah.
so like my first book was, a lot of it was oral history interviews, getting people who were at an historic experience to talk about their experience to you. You transcript it, and then you find paper documentation that's not
Mm-hmm.
redacted in my first book, right? And you then create like a Venn diagram or like a triangulation of evidence that allows you to reliably state, based on what you found,
Mm-hmm.
what might occur in a scene of this history. This was like crazy. This was
Yeah.
different. Like there were only extremely limited number of living people who were around who had experienced any of these things,
Sure.
and I'm dealing with more than 10,000 pieces of paper in my house, and my husband every day is trying to clean around it. And I'm telling him, like, don't touch it. I asked my friend who was a lawyer, a litigation attorney, how do you create a war room? How do you get through like in the midst of trial discovery? How do you get through a massive amount of documents? And he says,
Yeah.
there's no way around. You just have to, like, this corner I'm going to go through. And he was like Post-its. He was like piles. He's like, and then just persistence and accepting your fate for a while, that it's going to seem like you're not making progress, because all you're going to be doing for several months is just reading and piling things and noting stuff that's interesting. And eventually he was like, the human brain is this miraculous organizing device, and it will do work for you that you don't even understand, to start to arrange these things in an order.
Mm-hmm.
And then, and from there you can create then an outline, based on the organization that your brain started, a working kind of setup. And from there, once you have an outline, then you can actually start with, like, what's the best place? What's the first in media res, if I'm going to do this scene, to start with? And then how would I go about writing it? Where, in which piles do I have things that I could use to collage together the facts of what happened in this scene that I've just told myself I wanted to write. And then from there, the weird thing that happens is you'll then be able to write, well, at least what I do, a really crappy first draft, and then a really crappy second draft, and a really crappy third draft. And then and eventually you start to hone down and make progress. And then you eventually end up with like a really tight and really great scene. But that's only after, 95 to 98% of the work. Because most of nonfiction writing, if you were to peek into the book or into my manuscript, which I don't let anyone see as I'm writing this thing, you're going to see a really bad book. And you have to just think. And I kept telling my husband, this book is just not working out. It's just not grooving. I don't know what's going on. And Ryan kept telling me, he's like, Bobby, what do you remember? Trust the process.
Yes.
This is part of the process of refinement. And don't judge the thing, right?
Yes.
Too early. You're not even giving it a chance. And I was like, I married the right person.
You did. You really did. Yeah. Thank you, Jess.
Yeah.
I talk about this all the time. I've said it before, but I think it's really important for struggling writers who are in the process to hear, you have to, and it's a cliche at this point. You have to do so much bad writing to get to the good stuff. And I think that writing is an art form where we're so infrequently privy to the process. I can watch a time lapse of an artist making art, but I can't I can't visualize the messy drafts of my favorite books. All I see is this beautiful finished product. And so as often as I can hear other writers be like, no, there was a lot of starting and finishing and deleting that got me to where I was comfortable at all remotely with what I had done. Yeah,
it helped me. When I was younger and had more money, because I had this ad career prior to diving into my literary life, I would travel to Europe, and I had a trip. I took a trip to Dublin, and there's this exhibition on Yeats's poems, and it specifically has the poet Yeats's drafts. And I love Yeats's poetry. They're absolutely gorgeous. But you see all the handwriting and hand wringing and all the word changes in his drafts. And I looked at the drafts, and I suddenly felt so much better about everything having to do with the writing process, where you realize there's no trick.
Totally.
It's sort of just and there's the quality of a work almost oftentimes is determined by the number of times a person returns to it. And you could see that this is true for probably one of Ireland's greatest poets was okay, that's sort of my stick. Cause and then also as over time, with sheer word count, you sort of increase and develop your ability too. But I know a lot of teachers, with MFA programs or whatever, everyone asks this weird, inane question, can great writing be taught? They ask, it's so pompous. And I always think about the reverse of it, which is can great writing be learned? And I actually think, it's only learned. It's only learned.
Yeah, I utterly agree. And to get back to the book a little bit, there's a real sense of sadness and righteous anger when reading American Scare, at least for me as a gay person. And I think in a lot of ways, because reading it right now, which is kind of, we were alluding to this conversation earlier, reading it right now in this moment felt shockingly familiar to me, particularly with regards to Florida politics, but also just federal politics and federal attacks on the queer community.
Yeah.
And it did get me thinking about something that I've thought about a lot kind of since COVID, has been the impact a book can have on the time that it happens to be released. And authors have no say in when their books are coming out into the world. And sometimes it's eerie how their books can sort of reflect a time as well. So I'm just curious, what is your relationship with your book as it's coming out, with the world we live in, and the research you had to do for the book itself?
Yeah, I feel every narrative history, while rendered finds a way of speaking to the present day. Sometimes it's a dotted line relationship, but you can see sort of ripples or rhymes with oftentimes if you really look for them. And unfortunately, I feel like this particular book has become not a dotted line relationship, but a sort of direct line relationship with our current political situation. And I'm sorry to say that. I sort of wish that this was just like this interesting left field delve into America's past and look at this part of the crossover between the civil rights and other intersectional movements that we didn't know about. And sadly, this book showed for me it explains something I couldn't understand, because I've been very disoriented about the state of America and the state of myself in it. And this book for me provided, through Charlie Johns' story, provided the through line whereby I understood how Tallahassee politics became national politics.
Yes, informed a lot of what we understand today about politics.
Yeah, through various social scares. About once a decade, they will kind of emanate from this beautiful peninsula that and it's still mystifying to me how someplace so naturally gorgeous that offers potentially such a high quality of life has created one of the most disgusting and poisonous political infrastructures as the Tallahassee political infrastructure. But now we exist in this day and age where, the politics of personal spoils, the politics of vendetta, the politics of intrigue, the politics of, if you have power, you can go get someone. Like that's the baseline for post-Reconstruction Florida politics, which thrived until basically it was brought to the brink and fell apart at the end of the Johns Committee, and then it has these periodic rebirths. We're in this era now where our current Attorney General, and this actually, because this airs in June, so who knows what the political future will. But the former Florida Attorney General had become the U.S. Attorney General. The Secretary of State is a former Florida senator. Basically, Florida, since the 2000s, has really established itself as this political kingmaker, which is really perilous because it's actually one of the most unstable political systems in the country. And so anyway, it's almost impossible to read Charlie Johns' story and the story of the Johns Committee and not see echoes of and a little bit of foreshadowing of future political leaders. You can see Charlie Johns was charming and a great person, great at making friends, even if he was a segregationist. Like what a political enemy once said of him is that you can't help but not like Charlie Johns. I have to remind myself that I hate him. And I think I see echoes of sort of Mitch McConnell's ability to work parliamentary mechanisms. In Charlie Johns, I see a little bit of Bill Clinton and George W. Bush's capacity to charm and make friends. Like Bill Clinton and like George W. Bush, Charlie Johns had this elephantine memory for names, which is the greatest, turns out in America, the greatest political skill you can have if you're of a certain cadre of politician. He could remember everyone upon first introduction, plus where they're from, names of their children, name of their spouse, such that when he met them again years later, he could just pull this out of his mental Rolodex. Charlie Johns could make you feel special. He also referred to him, he was among the first, granted, there's a whole lineage of this, but he was a politician that kind of painted himself as an everyman populist type, but who actually was quite an elitist with the way he held power. And he, an interesting thing and kind of a crazy thing about him that I don't even know. It's nuts to think about. Was his capacity to basically use his personal position to enrich himself and to get anyone jobs around him that he wanted to. So he sold ice in Florida. That's part of how he got rich. He
like
sold ice in Florida.
and it is, yeah, like the beyond like the uh overarching politics of today. Also, you're right, like seeing in politicians like reflections of the past, and yeah, you're right, like almost, yeah, like future casting, like I can see these people and where it's headed at the same time. I mean, hopefully not, but
He referred to himself in the third person.
yes,
This
that was
happened once he got enough
interesting.
power.
Yeah.
He became this idea in abstraction of himself, and
Hmm.
then he would be like, Charlie Johns thinks that. No, Charlie Johns wouldn't think that, but he's Charlie talking
Yeah.
about Charlie Johns.
Yeah. Yeah.
And something happens, I think, when you have that. There's a fracturing of the self that has to do with
Mm.
power seeking, then, or which we see in a lot of political figures now.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah. And something I think that is really special about reading historical nonfiction is that it sort of helps us, it maybe forces us to like work our empathetic muscles. And if you, I think because when you read something that is historical with too much of a modern lens, maybe it's easy for me to make it seem like it'd be so easy to like make more noise or push back when you're being attacked, but that's like so unkind to like the time in the history of this place. And when someone finally does, again, I cannot say too much because I don't want to give anything away, but like it gets to a point where someone does fight back, and I literally pumped my fist in the air. I was like, finally, like, yes.
Right.
But then you recognize like what a risk this was for that person. Like it either could have acted as a powder keg, or it could have backfired. Like so easily it could have backfired. And even you yourself, like you reference in the book, I think it's Art who says like it's hard for him as an older man to like take on the identity of queer because of just the
Yeah.
history of that word for him. And while
Yeah.
people say they understand, they sort of quietly judge him for it. And you like very lovingly say like, and I was one of those people. And
Sure.
that is so easy to do. And I think is a beautiful part of reading historical nonfiction is that it not only puts us into those worlds, but it also reminds us of like our privilege within the community. And I'm just curious, like, can you talk a little bit more about mentally where you have to go as the writer in
Yeah.
placing yourself in that moment in history while writing historical fiction, or I'm sorry,
Sure.
historical nonfiction?
Yeah, that's okay. So for especially for the material involving queer people who were hunted by the Johns Committee, I had to think about what was the baseline for old Southern gaydom, LGBT, non-hetero behavior, and understanding that they existed by and large still in the 50s and 60s in this sort of pre-World War II system that they sometimes in the South call the open secret or the public secret or the social compact, or they'll sometimes call it live and let live. There's different ways that they refer to it. But anyway, it has to do with the non-verbalization and non-identification of non-hetero behavior, even and especially if you're the one participating in it. There's a phrase that gay Charlestonians would say that you can. I won't swear because I don't even have to.
No,
I don't
please
know
go
if you
for
can
it. Yes,
swear.
please.
They said you can fuck an elephant on King Street if you do it wearing a navy blue blazer. There's this idea this idea of if you, especially within the system of Southern segregation, if you as a non-hetero, especially white person, agree to abide by certain rules of discretion, and also to not particularly identify yourself with those male behaviors or female behaviors, then you are allowed to sort of entertain and have this be part of your life and existence. And so this is so different from post-World War II identification of homosexual life, leading into the Mattachine, like leading into Stonewall gay liberation. I had to kind of erase all this notion and think about, I'm a person. If I had these same feelings these innate biological characteristics in my body that I would be feeling for someone else of the same person born with the same sex as me, then and if I was in Florida in this era, I would be thinking of the behaviors as sort of like a more verb than noun. It would be a thing I did when I went to go to a cruising zone. It would be like it would be really hot and complicated horseplay that I would then put out of my mind almost as soon as I was done with it.
Yeah, completely.
And the people with whom I did it with, I would either never see again, or I would think of as a close friend who knew never to bring this up.
Right.
And I may have a whole other life that I wouldn't even think of as a second life. I would have a post World War II, I would have the kind of straight home that people thought I should have. I would have a loving wife who I may actually love. But with these added sexual complications, I would have children, I would have a job, etc. And I would understand that any public disclosure of this other behavior that I tend towards, like preternaturally, I can't avoid it. I just seek it out. I need it. That would lead to the destruction of all those things and my career and my ability to own a house, all these things. And so this is what made the Johns Committee's targeting of these individuals within this southern Florida milieu so intense, such like an intensive rape of the mind almost, is because these people were pulled out of their behaviors that they didn't even really fully identify with, though they engaged with it. And then they were labeled by the state, right? And then they were made accountable for behaviors that they had been told were just that this was sex play. This was just something I engaged with on the side of my life. And so long, and I did it in a society that for years had agreed, so long as the sex play I was engaging with wasn't racial miscegenation, wasn't of the black male to white female variety, that they were going to ignore it and let me do whatever. So I would feel suddenly like my whole world order had crumbled, and I would be embarrassed by the words people are using. They were using words in the 50s and 60s. This is an era where it's controversial if Lucille Ball's pregnant on television.
Yes.
And so, like, you have a state investigator that had yanked you out of a courthouse bathroom where you maybe were masturbating with a stranger, and they used the word masturbate. Your entire mind would go, and oftentimes this is why a lot of individuals, when they're being interrogated by the state, by the Johns Committee, would not know to hide. They wouldn't know to ask for a lawyer. They wouldn't know to not. If it was possible to not name names, they wouldn't understand where to go with these things. So I had to sort of place myself, do little mental backflips and somersaults and stuff to place myself
unlearn things.
Yeah, place myself into that space of mind so that I can have compassion and I can also understand the type of fear that would be exuding from their pores when they're in this situation, when they think something that they would never be held accountable for, the state just caught them for.
Yes. And like, you're so right, especially because it's so easy to, like, when they're being interrogated and not told anything, any of their rights, that they have a right to a lawyer, and alluding to the fact that, like, you're not going to get in trouble for telling us anything, but we will make this public, FYI. And like, modern me can easily be like, stop ratting out your fellow queer people, but I'm also like, but like, they literally felt like they're, like you're saying, like it offers so much empathy for these people who like really were just like trapped and forced into a corner, and were doing everything they could to uphold this like concept of the life that they felt like they needed to have. It's just so it's sad and scary.
It was the only life and the only model posed to them.
Yes.
Was this post World War II man. So what were they supposed to occupy then?
Right.
They don't know. There would be no place in society for them. And for many individuals, and for most of us actually, shame is worse than death.
Mm-hmm.
So the idea that they were being shamed and that this shame would cease to be private and would become, in a Southern context, public, would lead to just basically a complete and total destruction of the self. When they're in that, when state investigators are putting, have them in the hot seat for hours and are putting the screws on them and threatening to ruin the reputations of their wives and children too. It's a lot.
Yeah.
I want to say though, certain individuals, even in those states, in those dire circumstances, did not cave and give names. And one was individual who is one of the major figures in the book, is the Johns Committee survivor Art Copelston, who had prior training. He'd had a whole other life. He was an older undergraduate, even though he looks elvishly young and handsome. He was like 26, 27, 28 when he enrolls as a freshman undergrad at University of Florida. He'd had time in the Air Force where he was part of the OSI, Office of Special Investigations, and he understood what anti-homosexual surveillance hunts in the armed forces, or when done
incredible to read.
Yeah, when done by a federal or state agency looked like. So he had experience from that, so that when he was finally in the hot seat of the Florida Johns Committee, as a student in 58, 59 in University of Florida, Gainesville, he was able to withstand the enticement to think that if I give up names of fellow homosexuals to interrogators, that this will save me. He knew that you giving up any possible name is your confession.
Totally.
And so, and he was able to withstand that, and despite tremendous pressure, including at one point in the midst of one of his interrogations, the Florida investigators produced the number of the correct phone number of his mother and stepfather, and threatened to call them to let them know what a disgusting son they had, to rat him out and rat out his sexuality to his parents. And that would have been for other reasons in the book that are not just per se, that's traumatic, but because of his individual circumstance, even worse. His mother was a recovering alcoholic. She was just, sort of in a febrile state of sobriety. I mean, so for him to have been able to resist is an incredible thing. And Art is an incredible guy. I consider him not just like a historic source, but we've become friends over the course of, and I've interviewed him more for this book than I've interviewed any source before ever. I've had more than 30, at least 1 hour interview sessions with him to try to understand what happened to him when the state of Florida targeted him as an undergrad in the late 50s, and also how that affected the rest of his life.
I was another really lovely and felt like literary thing about American Scare was Art's story. It would seemingly come to a close, and then near the end it returned to him, and I was like, oh my god, please let Art be okay, let Art be okay. Like when we got to his graduation, I was like, let him graduate, please let him graduate. And I was really like on the edge of my seat being like, please let this man survive this. And I was very grateful that he did. But you mentioned Tinderbox earlier, your first book that came out in 2018, correct?
I have the for people watching curious on YouTube.
Oh, well, I've got mine as well.
Yeah.
I am curious about the differences and the similarities in the publishing experience with your first book and your second book.
Well, my first book, Tinderbox, it took me about 5 years to write this too. It's about the Upstairs Lounge fire, which is a notoriously unsolved arson fire that took place at a gay bar on the ragtag fringes of the French Quarter in 1970s New Orleans that claimed 32 lives. And the process of publishing it was unconventional. And it caused a little bit of waves, I think, because I graduated in 2013 co-valedictorian from the Columbia Journalism School. And basically, when you graduate that high from a really famous school, and I'm not bragging, I'm just telling you what you can do. You have a small but significant window to do something really cool with it. And I got approached about the possibility, would you ever think about writing about this event? I'd never been to New Orleans. I really hadn't written a lot of journalism that was an investigation into America's queer past before, but I'd always, in my mind, wanted spiritually to travel to New Orleans, to have an era there. I always wanted to tell a story in my mind about blue collar queer folk, working class queer folk, and what happens when tragedy or emergency or catastrophe befalls them. And so I thought I do want, so based on my conversation with the editor, I thought I'm interested in checking this out. I traveled down to New Orleans and I stayed with the only two friends I knew in town, they let me stay in their wisteria scented sunroom that it would heat up by 9 a.m. because it was like New Orleans, there's so much sun. So I'd have to get out and report no matter how late I was out drinking. And then I spent a year writing the proposal for this editor, Bob Weil at Norton Liverite. It was rejected several times. Eventually they accepted it. And then it took me an additional about 4 years to complete, to report and complete the writing for Tinderbox, and it came out in 2018. This one, American Scare, the process was more of a traditional, although Norton had I don't know if I'm even supposed to talk about this, but I will. Norton had an option on American Scare, but also we had the ability me and my agent had the ability to pass on the option.
Nice.
And we wanted to go into the open market, and I wanted to try out. I had a really great experience with a really amazing editor who I felt like I'd learned a lot from, Bob Weil at Liverite. And I wanted to sort of see, I had no other conception of what experiences would be like writing books for other places. Yeah. So it took me, I started in 2019, the proposal for American Scare. I spent about 8 months on the proposal, and then my agent started shopping it. And then we found our home at Penguin Dutton in the early part of 2020, believe it or not.
Wow.
And then the book sold to Dutton on the proposal on Mardi Gras Day 2020. So this is right before the world closes down.
Seriously.
I was marching in there's this you wear Mardi Gras outfits. There's this Mardi Gras tradition in my neighborhood it's called the Bywater, which is right by the Mississippi River, but you can march from the Bywater into the French Quarter, called the Secret Society of St. Anne. So I was dressed up in my Mardi Gras outfit. We were all had our favors and stuff. I'm surrounded by one person's dressed like Miss Piggy. I'm another person's dressed like Darth Vader. And I got the call from my agent that the proposal for American Scare sold to Dutton. It was interesting. When I was shopping the proposal, a lot of editors didn't understand. They kept asking me, why Florida though? Why Florida? Don't you want to make it bigger? How about if we make it about not just Florida, but the whole South and maybe a little bit of the West. They have this concept. A lot of editors have this conception that people will only read a book about where they're from. And so I kept being no, I'm a kind of person that does setting as character.
Yes.
You know what I mean? I read a lot of heady science fiction where I'm into world building. My first book, Tinderbox, I felt one of the most major characters in Tinderbox was the city of New Orleans. Mm-hmm. And I wanted to do a book where the state of Florida was a character. Yes. And I was like, if I followed your advice to broaden this, then I lose the whole Florida's a character thing.
Yes.
So, but Dutton got it. And then then they wrote it out with me with obviously the COVID lockdown meant that the state of Florida archives were closed. But then people didn't realize that when Governor DeSantis of Florida reopened the schools, he didn't open the archive. Mm-hmm. He kept that closed for as long as he wanted. And then so it wasn't until May 2021 that archive reopened. And I swear to God, I was there close to the first day. I was the only gay guy speeding towards Tallahassee. You know what I mean? With my masks ready to go there. And that's sort of been and then it was this longer process of having them understand with my publisher, look, this is really hard. All the state of Florida archives documents are intensively redacted. It's going to take time. Then I had to tell them, oh no, we had a breakthrough. Bonnie Stark, the whistleblower, has given us the secret second set of John's Committee records. I'm going to be able to decensor a lot of stuff because I'm living among it. Beyond that, I have lists. Bonnie did so much work. This is a list of the fired teachers that she pulled out. This is stuff this is research that the whistleblower gave me. So I was I have sort of ways to decipher this stuff. Yes. But I had to tell my publisher that's going to add time, like in order for us to write the book that we need. And then I put in at the beginning of when the proposal sold, I put in a FOIA request to the FBI for any Johns Committee documents. And those can take years and years. Mm-hmm. And in the middle of decensoring the Bonnie Stark papers, guess what? The FBI FOIA request dropped. And it was crazy what they had in there. It was absolutely crazy what was in there. Turns out they knew what was happening with the Johns Committee, and that they even had to respond and do further research based on the spurious false claims that the Johns Committee made in its reports to the state legislature, where the Johns Committee basically lied to the rest of the state. And the federal government had to figure out where the lies were, and then be like, okay, this was all a waste of time.
Yeah.
But so anyway, so that additional drop took more time. That's where I have to be like, hey, good news and bad news. We got more stuff, and it's going to take more time to incorporate it. And then eventually I have to be like, look, like I can't live with this difficult story anymore. It has to be done. It has to be over. At some point, I have to acknowledge I've found the most I can find and put into this book that where it works in a cohesive and artistic manner. And that also I need to move on too. Like I can't I don't want to be one of those like Miss Havishams that like when you're living with a book for 20 years and like I'm wearing the old and I'm wearing the old wedding gown for when I was left. I just don't want that experience. So I was like, I'm like, okay, what I'm going to have to do is accept this is the best it's going to be. This is the most I can do. And I'll have to accept this is the Johns Committee book I can write. And this is the one that Dutton's going to get, whether they like it or not. And then I have to accept that I'm going to try to find some way to leave the door open with all of this research to ensure that someone else can take their crack at it and do their version of the story. And so that was a long-winded answer, but that was sort of the process whereby each of these two books happened. In both cases, I was kind of spoiled. I had editors and publishers willing to move back publication deadlines.
Lovely.
And not turn to me and be like, you owe the advance money back. Because like, girl, that money got spent.
Yeah. Sorry, babe. Yeah.
Okay. You want it back? Try to get, what are you, the mob? You're not going to break my knees. It's not going to work. And in both cases I had, hitting reportorial walls and then hitting breakthroughs that cause other things. And then, writing itself takes its own chunk. Where totally. You're not reporting anymore, and that's sort of its own discipline and time, which makes it so nice when I'm interacting with people who read it, because like I lived with this by myself for so long when it was like I was like nurturing it, and I wanted to make sure this baby boy had like a heart and lungs and legs to stand up and walk away from me. And like, so I really love now this process where readers are going to be able to engage with it.
Yeah. I'm so excited for readers to get a hold of it. And, I'm just really happy for you. And, I couldn't recommend the book more. I think like nonfiction readers, fiction readers will get a lot out of it. And this has been so lovely. I could talk to you for like another hour.
I know.
Where can people find you online? Should they want to? Should you want them to?
Yeah. I'm on Instagram at WordBobby. I'm on Threads at WordBobby. I think I'm on Blue Sky now. I was on Twitter, but that got mean, so I'm not there anymore. Yeah. And I'm only on Facebook. Like if you reach out to me, I'm only there because I have this aunt with dementia that like is only on Facebook, and she likes to send me little cards and stuff. And then I talk to her in the comments. Yeah, but so anyway, so I'm not as reachable via Facebook. And then my website is rwfieseler.com. And then you could buy American Scare wherever books are sold. But I like to say, get it from an indie bookstore, please.
Absolutely. Yeah. We'll be linking it as well, because it'll be available once this goes live. But Bobby, Robert, thank you so much. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you. This was so lovely.
Thanks for listening to Writer's Digest Presents. Visit us online at writersdigest.com and make sure to follow us on social media at Writer's Digest for daily updates on articles, online courses, live events, and more. See you next time.